All right, so let's move now into how it is that moving the thorax moves the lungs. So we know that the lungs and the thorax, they generally move in tandem. They move together. So you expand your thorax, you expand your rib cage, your lungs go with it. You relax your rib cage, you relax your thorax, your lungs move with it. When you're at a resting position, you've relaxed your thorax, you're not moving at all. The lungs are pulling in on the walls of the thorax a little bit, and the walls of the thorax are pulling out on the lungs a little bit. So in a natural resting position, lungs are somewhat more expanded, and the thorax is somewhat more compressed. When we enlarge our thorax for inspiration, because that is what we're talking about, we're doing all this to talk about respiration. You expand your thorax in the transverse, in the horizontal dimension, by flaring out your rib cage. So if you want to take a deep breath, your rib cage expands up and out, as we've already talked about. So that expands the thorax in the transverse dimension, which pulls the lungs transversely with it, expands the lungs in the transverse dimension with it. As you do that, as I take a deep breath, the diaphragm, which is the muscle that my lungs are sitting on, it's under my lungs. We're going to talk about the diaphragm in detail here in a little while. But when I expand my thorax for inspiration, the diaphragm contracts and pulls down, and it's pulling down on the bottom of the lungs. So when the diaphragm contracts and lowers, it expands the thorax in the vertical dimension, thereby expanding the lungs vertically. So the lungs move with the thorax. And in order for the lungs to be pulled by the thorax, to be expanded by the thorax, and then to follow the thorax as the thorax retracts and relaxes, there has to be a connection between the lungs and the thorax. And there is. There's a suction that exists between the linings of the lungs and the linings of the inside thoracic wall. That is how the lungs and the thorax are connected to one another. They're connected via a suction between their linings. Let's get into more detail about what these linings are. We call these linings the pleural membranes, or simply the pleura. The pleura that is encasing each lung is the visceral pleura. So the visceral pleura, you can think of it as being attached directly to the lung, but it's a slimy membrane on the outside. And then the inside of the thoracic cavity, the inside of the chest wall, is covered by the parietal pleura. You can think of the parietal pleura as being connected directly to the chest wall, but being slick and slimy and smooth on the outside. So there's no direct connection between the parietal and the visceral pleura. What there is between them is a fluid called surfactant. And this is a slimy, mucousy fluid. All right, so looking at this cross section, here's the wall of your chest cavity. So that's the wall of your thorax. So moving deeper, so under the wall of your thorax, you have the parietal pleura. and that is attached directly to the wall of the thorax. And then here you have the lung, and on the outside of the lung, you have the visceral pleura that is attached directly to the lung. So you can think of the visceral pleura as being like a layer of saran wrap almost that is glued to the lung. You can think of the parietal pleura as a layer of saran wrap that is glued to the inside of the thorax. But they are not glued to each other. Between the parietal and the visceral pleura, there's nothing but surfactant. So what happens is that when the chest wall is expanded, there's no way air can get in or out from between the parietal or visceral pleura. So if air can't get in or out of what we call the interpleural space, and the chest wall starts moving out like this, or the diaphragm starts pulling down, then the visceral pleura that is continuous with the parietal pleura, as the parietal pleura starts pulling away, there's a vacuum there. There's no way air can get in or out, so the visceral pleura is going to follow the parietal pleura. And in this way, when you expand the thorax, when you expand the rib cage and drop the diaphragm, the lungs are pulled out with it, with the thorax. And when the thorax relaxes, and goes back in, then the parietal pleura will push in on the visceral pleura, and the lungs will contract. The volume of the lungs will get smaller. So the pleural membranes, to restate what I've already said, the pleural membranes are continuous with each other. The visceral pleura encases the lungs. The parietal pleura is the lining on the inside of the thorax. There is a vacuum between these two layers, so that wherever the thorax goes, the vacuum between the pleura is always there. So when the thorax expands, the lungs are pulled along with the thorax. When the thorax relaxes and retracts, the lungs are allowed to retract. And what we're talking about here is expanding the thorax, which expands the volume of the lungs, which decreases air pressure within the lungs, which causes air to flow from the environment, from the atmosphere into your body. You can have infections of the pleura. You can have something that is called a collapsed lung. So if I'm walking outside with my pencil or my pen and I fall on the pen and it stabs me straight in through the chest wall, through the parietal pleura, that is going to allow air to get from the outside environment out here, where it's positive pressure, into the vacuum that exists between the pleural membranes. And when that happens, basically the tension between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura is going to disappear and the lung is just going to collapse. The parietal pleura is divided into the mediastinal section, or the mediastinal pleura. So that's the section of parietal pleura that is around the mediastinum. It's divided into the diaphragmatic pleura, and this is that layer of parietal pleura that is against the diaphragm. So the mediastinal pleura would be right here, because your heart is going to be right here in the mediastinum. Diaphragmatic pleura is going to be right here. Apical pleura, apex, apical, that's going to be at the top. So the superior most section of the parietal pleura is the apical pleura. And then that section of the pleura that is associated with the ribs, meaning laterally, that is the costal pleura. So mediastinal, diaphragmatic, costal, and apical pleura, these are sections of the parietal pleura. Looking at this cadaver here, you can see here, this is a lung with no pleural lining on it. Here, you can see the visceral pleura still on the lung, and you can see the parietal pleura here on the inside of the thoracic cavity.